So we have the new M3 MacBook Air here. I'm going to be unboxing it, showing you it, but I also have the M1 MacBook Air and the M2 MacBook Air, and I wanted to share the sort of differences between the three and which one is actually worth going for, because even though the M3 MacBook Air is new, it's a new machine that they've just released, I actually think you can get some good deals with other machines like the M2 and even the MacBook Pro. So let's get into this first, unbox it and see what's in the box. Not much has really changed, but we'll look at it anyway. So this is the base model M3 MacBook Air. It has 8 GB of unified memory, 256 GB of storage. It's always nice unboxing a new MacBook Air. And yeah, just as thin as expected. It's so thin, it always blows my mind. Inside we have a braided MagSafe cable. This is actually a really nice MagSafe cable, and it is color matched to the machine. This is in space gray. And then in here we have the charging brick. This is a 30-watt charging brick, USB-C. I know that if you do end up upgrading the chip in this from the base M3 to one of the ones with a few more cores, they do give you a more powerful charging brick. In here, let's have a look. We of course have stickers. We have the really nice space gray stickers as well here. And they feel thicker and nicer as well. And we'll get to the machine. So this is the space gray model. I really do like the space gray model. I would highly recommend not going for the midnight blue. The midnight blue is a really nice color and I really like it. But the only issue with the midnight blue is that it fingerprints and marks up so easily. I had a lot of issues with the midnight blue version that I actually ended up returning my model and exchanging it for a space gray, because the midnight blue, once you've touched it, once you've used it and it has all the fingerprints and oils on it, it just looks quite tatty. So I'd recommend one of the lighter colors like the space gray up to silver, or even the starlight. The starlight color I think is gorgeous, but I am a big fan of space gray. So if we compare it to the two other models that I have the M1 MacBook Air here from 2020, and we also have, it's actually quite dusty, I haven't used it for a while, but we have the 13-inch M2 MacBook Air from last year. So if we have these three models together, the M2 MacBook Air and the M3 MacBook Air, they look completely identical. It's actually impossible to tell the difference between the two from the outside. The only difference, of course, between the two is the chips. There is literally no other difference. So I'll put the specs on screen so that you can see the difference between the specs on the M1 MacBook Air, the M2 MacBook Air, and the M3 MacBook Air. And a few differences between the M1 version versus the M2 and the M3 version is that the display is brighter on these models. It's 400 nits on the M1 MacBook Air and then 500 nits on the M2 and the M3 MacBook Air. The battery life is also completely the same. 18 hours across all three models, which is nice to see. I actually thought that maybe they might make the battery life better on the M3 model, just because I thought it might be a bit more optimized. But I think what they've done is they've actually kept the battery life at the same, but then just giving you a bit more power. So I guess that is optimized in a way, you could say. But yeah, 18 hours of battery life on these MacBooks is incredible. And that is the thing that always amazes me when I use these machines. So this is my main machine that I take with me when I go on a holiday, because I don't need my MacBook Pro. I take this because it's lighter and smaller, the M2 MacBook Air. And with that 18 hours of battery life, sometimes it can last me the whole week, because I'm only using it maybe for an hour or two a day, just doing some light work, emails and stuff like that. And then I'm sort of spending the rest of the day out. And it's just amazing how the battery on this can just last so long. I don't really have to worry about it. Another thing which I completely forgot to mention is that the screen on the M2 and the M3 MacBook Airs is a little bit bigger than the screen on the M1 MacBook Air. So it's 13.3 inches versus 13.6 inches. There is a little bit more resolution on the M2 and the M3 MacBook Air compared to the M1 MacBook Air, but it's really not much. It's just a few more pixels to make up for the screen height. When it comes to the core count across all three machines, it is pretty much exactly the same, except for the base model on the M1 MacBook Air. The base model just has a 7-core GPU versus an 8-core GPU on these two models. Another thing which I think a lot of people don't realize is that even though these models, the M2 and the M3 MacBook Airs with the new redesign, even though they seem a bit thicker compared to the M1 MacBook Air, which has this sort of wedge-shaped design, they're actually lighter. They're 500 grams lighter compared to the M1 MacBook Air. Now, 500 grams doesn't seem like much, but I feel like if it's on your back in a backpack and you're carrying that through an airport or you're just traveling, walking around, 500 grams can make a difference. Like, it really can make a difference. The other difference with these two machines compared to the M1 Air, of course, is that you have a better webcam, you have better speakers. You also have technically an additional port. So with the M1 MacBook Air, you only have the 2 Thunderbolt ports, the 2 USB-C ports. One of them obviously has to be used for charging, and then you only have 1 free. But with these models, the newer models, you have the MagSafe port for charging, and then you still have 2 USB-C, 2 Thunderbolt ports that you can do whatever you like with. So it's nice to see that one of the ports isn't being used up just to charge the machine. One notable difference between the M3 MacBook Air compared to the other 2 models is that you can now connect 2 external displays at the same time to the M3 MacBook Air. But there is a catch. When you do connect up 2 displays, you have to close the lid on the M3 MacBook Air. You can't use the display on the M3 MacBook Air. So you can't have 3 displays. You can only have 2 at a time. So that does mean you will probably need a mouse and a keyboard, an external mouse and keyboard, to use 2 external displays with the M3 MacBook Air. One thing I am disappointed to see though with this new machine is that the unified memory and the storage is the same. It starts at 8 gigabytes of unified memory and 256 gigabytes of storage, which I think is just silly now. Like, it doesn't really make any sense as to why there is such little unified memory and there's such little storage. Other sort of machines in the space now, you know, they're coming with 16 gigabytes and 512 gigabytes of storage as standard. I feel like Apple are being quite cheeky here. I do really think they need to be sort of putting 16 gigabytes as the minimum, because 8 gigabytes unified memory, it might be okay for light browsing, for light work, but as soon as you start doing other stuff, especially as apps and sort of websites and stuff become more resource hungry, you know, you don't want to be using up all that RAM. You don't want to be using that unified memory. And of course, that unified memory has to be shared between the GPU and the CPU. So you can easily saturate it if you have multiple programs, multiple apps open at the same time. I found a Medium article where someone compared the 3 chips together, some quick tests, which I'll leave a link to. But in here, something that's very notable is the SSD speed. You can see the SSD speed on the M1 MacBook Air is basically double compared to the M2 and the M3 MacBook Air. And the reason for that is the chip that they're using in this. They're using 2 128 gigabyte SSD chips, and that is giving you sort of double the speed compared to these 2 machines. There's only 1 chip in each of these. So that's something to consider. If you're someone who's going to be importing and exporting files quite regularly on a machine like this, then it is probably worth upgrading to the 512 model. It's just such a shame that with the 256 gigabytes of storage, you're getting half the speed compared to the M1 MacBook Air. Now, when it comes to what I personally think is the best value out of all of these machines, I actually think it's the M2 MacBook Air, because the M2 MacBook Air has now dropped in price. They've actually discontinued the M1 MacBook Air. The M2 MacBook Air is now sort of the base model, and they've dropped the price to $1,000. However, if you have a look online, especially Apple certified refurbished or even Amazon, you can get this machine for $850. Which I think is actually incredible value. That is insane value for a machine like this, which has the M2 chip. Now, of course, it's a little bit slower than the M3 chip, but I really don't think most people are going to see the difference. And the reason why I think that is incredible value is because you're getting the all new design, you're getting the very slim clamshell design that follows the MacBook Pro models. You have the MagSafe port, you have a better webcam, a better screen. It's just an overall massive upgrade compared to the M1 MacBook Air. Now, of course, I do think the M1 MacBook Air is still the sort of value king if you're doing light stuff, because I looked earlier, you can find an M1 MacBook Air on Amazon refurbished for like $650, which again, $650 for a machine like this, I think that is mad value. But I think sort of great value all around. If you want the new design, if you want everything, I think the M2 MacBook Air makes a lot of sense. However, if you're someone who is considering upgrading the M3 MacBook Air or even the M2 MacBook Air to like 16 gigabytes unified memory or 512 gigabytes of storage, I'd actually recommend, so I have it written down here, I'd actually recommend looking at a M2 Pro 14-inch MacBook Pro, because to get one of those on Amazon, you're looking at around $1,500, which really isn't far off upgrading this to 16 gigabytes of unified memory and 512 gigabytes of storage, because the 14-inch MacBook Pro obviously has the M2 Pro chip, not just the standard chip. You get 16 gigabytes of RAM of unified memory as standard, and you get 512 gigabytes of storage, SSD storage as standard as well. I think that is like the value king if you're looking for a pro end machine. Now, of course, pro machines usually require pro work. It's only worth getting if you're doing pro work, things like video editing, photo editing, if you're doing any sort of graphical work, artwork, anything like that. I think that's what the pro machines are designed for. But if you're doing sort of light browsing, light admin work, Excel, maybe even some light coding and design work, you're going to be fine with any of these MacBook Air machines. I think Apple have really knocked it out of the park with the M chips. The only disappointment is the 8GB of unified memory and the 256GB of storage on the base models. I think that's the only thing that just makes them feel like, ugh, you know, Apple should really be upgrading them. So yeah, MacBook Air, if you're looking for a MacBook Air, I do think the M2 is the best value. If you're looking for a MacBook Pro, look at a certified refurbished model for like $1,500. I think those sorts of models right now are the best value. I don't think it's worth upgrading to an M3 model because you're just not going to see much of a difference compared to something like an M2. And obviously if you need a Pro machine, get a Pro machine. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter and subscribe for more.